Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, Developing a Comprehensive Integrated Pest Management Plan, also known as IPM. This presentation is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series, a series developed by a group of regional organizations known for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of our regional programs to a nationwide audience. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're all nonprofit and largely volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, and EcoLandscape California. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Alexis Doshas. Alexis is a graduate of the Environmental Studies Department at Antioch University with a concentration in conservation biology. Alexis is the Propagation and Facilities Coordinator at New England Wildflower Society's Nasami Farm, where their mission is to conserve and promote the region's native plants to ensure healthy, biologically diverse landscapes. Welcome, Alexis.
Thank you, Penny. All right. So as Penny was saying, I'm the Propagator and Facilities Coordinator with New England Wildflower Society. I work out of the native plant nursery at Nasami Farm in Whately, Massachusetts. And I began here as an intern in 2012, fresh out of Antioch, where I've been studying conservation biology. And so I had a real background in ecology. And one of the projects that interested me most was establishing an integrated pest management plan for the nursery. And so I went about this by investigating what the components of an integrated pest management plan are and how to use them in the nursery setting. And one of the first rules of an IPM is establishing your thresholds, because you're never going to completely eradicate a pest problem. We really want to get that out of your brain about getting rid of all pests. You really want to get it to a threshold that you can manage that works for your project. And so control is really the key word. And IPM is really based on ecology and symbiotic relationships of pests and plants. So as we know that there are, sometimes these are beneficial relationships, sometimes they are harmful, but they are often kept in balance through other systems. And when we get in there and start to be manipulating plants and pests for our own needs, we can really wreak havoc or really alter those relationships. So it's important to understand how they work and how we can use them for our benefit. And an example of establishing a threshold that we experienced, for instance, last season, many of you know the monarch population has been in a steep decline over the last decade. And at the farm, we had hardly seen a monarch among the fields and our beds for a couple of years. And last season, we were growing our Asclepias tuberosa, which is a butterfly weed, a host plant to the monarch larvae. And we discovered a monarch had laid eggs, and we were finding larvae eating and snacking on our Asclepias tuberosa, which was great. We were very excited, but as you can see, that's also damaging our seedlings and plants that we were hoping to be selling later in the season. So what we chose to do was to sacrifice a number of plants. We put them in a protected cage to rear off our monarchs. We actually supplementally fed them with some common milkweed leaves. You can see those larger leaves in the upper right-hand corner twice a day to feed their voracious appetites. And we ended up hatching out about 24 monarchs. So that was a really great experience. Whenever we found them on our stock plants, we would just move them to our nursery, as we called it. Conversely, we found down in the right-hand corner, we found the sphinx moth larvae caterpillar on some viburnum seedlings. And these seedlings are only about 8 to 10 inches tall with sparse foliage. And these sphinx moth caterpillars were really doing a number on the foliage, and we were starting to get concerned. So we chose to remove those caterpillars, and we actually relocated them to a more mature specimen out in the landscape. So it's really dependent on what you can handle, on the aesthetic, the expectations of your project that you're working on. But that is one very important part. So what is an IPM? I'm going to go through kind of the theory and the design of an integrated pest management plan. Then we're going to look at some common pests that you see in the nursery and the landscape, and some common beneficials that you'll see can be used in the nursery and the landscape. And then some other controls and habitat manipulation that you can use to control the pests and to encourage beneficials. So an IPM is an ecosystem-based approach that integrates practices for economical control pests. As I said, for control, not eradication. And it is effective, it's environmentally sensitive, it is safe for you, for the environment, for your kids, and it is much more economical than a lot of broad spectrum chemical applications. It was developed shortly after World War II. Scientists wanted to move away from, before World War II, it was more of a calendar-based application for pest control. So in the spring, you broadly apply to this substance, and in the fall, it's very much based on timing as opposed to what was present or pests that you saw. And scientists decided to move away towards more of an observation-based, get a technical advisor in there to kind of advise the production based on the evidence of pests, using monitoring, using biological control first before using a chemical control. So this is the kind of a paradigm of the traditional IPM that was developed. Obviously, the broadest here is prevention, followed by cultural sanitation methods, keeping your areas clean, hand pulling, physical, mechanical control of your pests, followed by biological control, and with that chemical or pesticide use at the very top of the judicial use of pesticides. Now at NASAMI, we wanted to fit with our designation as sanctuary. We really don't want to use any chemical or pesticide if we can help it. So I'm going to focus mostly on all of those other aspects. And just a word about chemical or pesticide use. Really, I know I'm probably preaching to the choir, but it's a last resort, and you use it very judiciously. Some techniques that if you have to use it, you can inject into your invasive, for instance, so through injection or painting on an herbicide. If you have to use a pesticide, use an OMRI certified. The Organic Materials Review Institute has a list. We use horticultural oils. We use Doc Bombers in cases of infestations, which is just a soap that will dry out soft-bodied pests. And I just want to talk a little bit. I was going to take glyphosate and talk about that. For instance, it's used in Roundup. It's used quite broadly throughout the population as an herbicide. And glyphosate is actually it goes into the plant and binds to the soil. So plants are not solid cell walls. They will exude. So once it goes through the plant, glyphosate can be exudated into the soil. And thankfully, glyphosate does bind with the soil, which helps keep it out of our waterways, but it does take anywhere from 6 to 8 days to be immobilized by bacteria, up to 6 months, so it can reside in your soil. And some studies have shown it being taken up by vegetation in the area. So just a case study in that. And then I have to, whenever I have an audience, make my case against neonicotinoid, which is a new series of pesticides, and they were heralded as a much safer alternative to the older pesticides because they did not affect mammals or humans. in the same way as some of these older ones do, that would be applied out to crops and fields and cause chronic issues for people and mammals working and living in those areas. So systemic pesticides or neonics are affect the insects by attacking their central nervous system and causing paralysis and death. Now, they are applied to seeds, soil, leaves, and these circulate throughout the plant tissue, get into every part of that plant. So they will kill any insects that feed on them, including our beneficials, because they are morphologically similar. Pests, an insect is an insect. So residue of these neonics has been found in the pollen and the nectar of these plants, as I suggested. It goes into every cell and tissues and can be picked up and consumed by flower visiting insects and pollinators. They can also persist in the soil for months or years after a single application and again be absorbed by nearby vegetation. So over-the-counter product rates are substantially higher than maximum label rates approved for agricultural crops. So what I mean by that is the products that are available for homeowners and the public actually allow you to use more and can therefore create more damage than what is allowed in agricultural crop production. So there is some work being done about regulating that, especially I think the Massachusetts State House is working on a pollinator bill that will require some training for homeowners to have access to some of these. And again, tens of millions of acres are treated annually with neonics, and they have been found to move throughout water, and they can persist for a very long time. So that's my argument against using any of those. And so back to the bottom tier of our IPM is sanitation and prevention. So you really want to make sure all your working surfaces, whether it be in a nursery and you're working at a transplanting a potting table, or you're working out in the field, you want to make sure that all of your tools are clean. We will often spray them down with a little 10% bleach solution after sessions of work, certainly between locations. If you're out gardening, you want to keep the areas free of weeds and old pots, old plant material, old soil. Keep all of your supplies off the ground and covered. We sanitize, if you're going to sanitize your greenhouses, use an OMRI certified disinfectant. Sanitize your old pots and trays, materials that if you're going to for reuse, so you don't transfer pathogens or pests. And also a good idea is to allow for a fallow period, whether it's in the nursery or landscape wide. If we are sanitizing greenhouses, we like to leave them empty for a few weeks up to a few months if possible. You know, you probably heard of doing this in agricultural fields and in your gardens, especially if you know you've had a pest or a problem, to kind of let those fields lie empty for a little while before replanting. And so one of the key things to understanding pests is really knowing what you're looking at, especially your pest insects. You don't want to identify it as whether it's a beneficial or a pest before you decide to squish it or whatnot. You want to squish the good guys. And there's a lot of tools out there. This chart here on the right is from bugguide.net, which I love to use. You can click, it's an interactive chart. You can click on the bug that looks most like the one that you are seeing. It will take you to that family with lots of photographs. It's an open source website, so there's a lot of entomologists and people who are really into bugs that can help you identify. You can upload pictures and get some answers that way. Your extension school often has ID cards and their websites that are very helpful. So, and many ways to identify these, it requires monitoring, because these pests can be very small and it may take a while for you to notice the damage that they are causing, and their population may have gotten to a point that's going to be hard to control by the time you notice it. So really scheduling some time to look at your plants, and I would recommend a hand lens. We all carry a hand lens with us. They're very inexpensive, great for identifying plants, but also great for identifying your pests. We also carry a small notepad and pencil when you for taking down like what plant you saw that on. So later on, when you're trying to identify it, you can look up, is that plant more susceptible? What kind of pests do they often have on them? And phone cameras I've actually found to become a great technological advance. They have some great, their ability to capture close-up pictures, and you can take that back and look online and compare, and as I said, upload those pictures to help you get identification. We have used sticky cards in the greenhouse. Mostly I use them in the spring for determining the rate of fungus gnat infestation I have on seed flats that often happen in those cool, moist conditions. I don't like to use them for a long period of time because they are indiscriminate and you will catch any other flying insect, including bees and butterflies. So just a word of caution using those. And monitoring tips: avoid wearing yellow or blue clothing. As you can see, the sticky cards come in yellow and blue. Many pests are attracted to these colors, and as you move from one place to the other, they may travel with you if you're wearing those colors and following you around. And again, avoid moving from infested areas into clean ones when possible. We will often, if we know we have a problem, we will address those plants at the end of the day or at a time before we're going to clean up. So we're not bringing any pests with us into the unaffected areas. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about identification and life cycles and some biocontrols that can be used per pest species. And these species are common pests that you see in the nursery and in the landscapes. So the P is preventative, following the biocontrols, meaning you can introduce them preventatively and see curatively. So if you need to have that pest present before these species will be able to help, before you want to introduce these species, I should say. So aphids we're probably all familiar with. They are 1/16 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch long. They come in green, brown, black, orange, red. They complete their cycle in 10 to 14 days. They are sap suckers, so they're going to suck nutrients out of your plants and your stems. They often kill leaves and small shoots, and they produce a honeydew which causes black sooty mold and also attracts other pests, as such the ants. So if you ever noticed ants on your plants, it's good to take a real close look and see if they are in fact farming aphids, which they will do because they want the honeydew that the aphids produce. And when you're going to treat aphids with biocontrols, one hint is you need to make sure that there are no ants there, because the ants will defend the aphids and attack your beneficial insects that you're trying to control the aphids with. So you only need to get rid of the ants first before you introduce your biocontrols, if that is in fact the situation you are in. And as you can see, we use lady beetles. The bold-faced is the biocontrols that we have used with success, but they're all listed there. Lady beetles, green lacewings, which we'll discuss later, and parasitic wasps are good choices. We have the shorefly and the fungus gnat. Now these are more often seen in nursery settings, but if you have plants, or if you're just growing seedlings from start or beginning your things, you might run into the fungus gnat. They are soil borne. They lay their eggs in the soil, and the larvae feed on decaying organic matter and root hair, so they can be really problematic. Some controls, cultural controls, to dry down the soil as much as possible between watering. You can use BT, which is watered in. We often use parasitic nematodes. We apply them every other week throughout the season, because we grow everything from seeds. We have a lot of seed flats around, and we find that's the best way to control, keep a handle on our fungus gnats. We also introduce predatory mites and predatory beetles whose larvae feed on fungus gnats. We have the mealybug. Probably everybody's pretty familiar with them. Sluggish, white waxy covering. They're also sap sucking. They also produce honeydew, which attracts other pests. Again, parasitic wasps, predatory beetles are good controls for these guys. Scale, we often see it on a lot of house plants. They're very small insects laid under a hard shell. They also are honeydew producing, and large infestations can cause your leaves to yellow and die. And again, parasitic wasps, predatory beetles, you can use neem oil extract or paraffinic oil. Again, those you're going to want to use at times of the day when you're not going to be seeing any bees or beneficials flying around. Thrips, we see a lot of in the greenhouse. They can be a pest, especially in their larval stage is when the most damage is done. They have got kind of an oblong body as the nymphs. They could overwinter in plant debris, so that's a good thing if you're in a nursery setting or even in a garden setting, kind of getting rid of some of the overwintering plant debris. Loose plant debris will be helpful. They distort and discolor flowers and buds, and you can find gray speckled areas on the leaves. And one way to see if you have a problem is if you're breathing over your plants. That's what I've noticed before whenever we're active watering over the plants, and you see a real flurry of the adults flittering around because they become more active when CO2 concentration is higher. Therefore, you can really see that, oh, they're here. Ways you can control it culturally is reduce excess water around thrips, vacuum up some of that plant debris if you're in a greenhouse, or to brush it out of the way. We've used predatory beetles, predatory mites, and predatory bugs, OMRI, and I'm going to get into those in just a minute. We also have the whitefly, which we don't see a whole lot, but they are here. They're also, again, the larvae or the sap suckers producing honeydew. You can use mites, wasps, and beetles to predate those larvae. And the two-spotted mite, which is can become a real devastation on your crops and in your landscapes. I know a lot of house plants, a lot of citrus become very susceptible to these guys. They're very hard to spot without a hand lens until you have a problem and you start noticing that webbing, which means they're laying eggs. So you really want to take a good look at the underside of the leaves with your hand lens. And if you see little orange bodies, little black spots, that is your two-spotted mite, and they can be difficult to get a handle on if they become well established. Monitoring tip, you can strike some foliage onto a piece of white paper or cardboard, and if you can see them walking around, that's one way. If you see 10 or more, you might need to get some control in there. They will speckle your leaves, the foliage will become bronze and drop prematurely. And we use predatory mites to kill the mites. So there's mites to kill mites, and there are different species for different conditions. So in the spring we use one type that is for cool, that thrives in cool, humid, and then later in a hot, humid conditions there are other species. Again, and you can also use horticultural oils. I've had success with neem in my own house plants, and again, the caveat of spraying with any of your bees or beneficials around. You got to be careful about that. The common slug. This is a snail without shell. We all probably know what these guys look like. They wreak havoc in the gardens and in the beds, feeding on decaying and live plant material. Most controls are actually cultural controls. You can flat boards down. They will go in there for shelter, and then you can collect them and destroy them. You can use protective barriers of coal, tar, ash, lime, other caustic substances because they have that soft body. It can be absorbed through the skin and become quite an irritant. I've had a lot of success using fermented products, beer or near beer, fermented food, to attract and drown them. And there is, commercial slug baits. For biocontrols, frogs or toads are very good. If you can encourage them in your gardens and spaces, they will do a number on your slugs, which is great. And then, of course, we're getting larger in size. We've got the rodents, chipmunks, squirrels, voles, moles, mice. They disturb seeds, your seedlings. They eat seeds. They dig into the pots, eat your bulbs, eat your rhizomes, wreak general havoc, creating nests and things. We use trapping, bait traps. If they're larger, we had a groundhog, for instance, set up near our retail plant, snacking on them, and we used to have a heart trap to get him out of there. And then you can, again, encourage predators, so encourage birds of prey, encourage cats or muscelids, and we'll be going into that in a minute. So now I want to introduce you to some beneficials, what they look like and what they do. There is the predatory beetles and bugs. We have the lady beetle family. And a word about the lady beetles, and most of the beetles and bugs, it is their larval stage that is predatory and parasitic. The adults are often nectivorous. So in order, you want to create a population of reproducing to really get the benefits of these guys. And the lady beetles, commercially, they're very difficult to rear in an insectary. So what you find commercially is wild harvested, and there's a lot of controversy over the sustainability of wild harvesting lady beetles, and also a question of invasiveness. Are you introducing a non-native species to your neck of the woods? So we really recommend just encouraging your native population of lady beetles. And they will come when it's quite amazing. We got a shipment of spirea from a retail plant partner that came with a bunch of green aphids infestation, and we set them aside, quarantined them, and we're monitoring them. And I had ordered some Atheta to correct some of that problem, and we actually noticed ladybug larvae had found them, and within a few weeks the problem was cleared up. So they're really quite effective. And yes, so the Orius and the Atheta are also predatory beetles who will lay their larvae in the areas and help with some of those problems. Parasitic nematodes, as I was discussing earlier, there are good nematodes, there are bad nematodes. So obviously you'll be getting a parasitic nematode that will take care of your fungus, mostly fungus gnat larvae. They penetrate them, they use them to relationship with symbiotic bacteria to kill the larvae and set up shop to rear their own nematodes and continue the cycle. They're really fantastic. Once you get them in a cake solution, you put them into a water solution, you can sample that under the microscope to check for viability, and you'll see them moving around. They can be watered in with a watering can, or on a larger scale as a hose adapter or a dosatron if you're in a nursery. Lacewing Chrysoppa species, they are easily identified by their beautiful translucent wings down there in the right-hand corner and green bodies. You can also spot their eggs. They put them up on these strands to prevent predation on the leaves, and it's really a fascinating thing if you find them when you're monitoring. You can also encourage them with lacewing boxes. You can buy them online or in catalogs. You can also find plans to build them yourselves, and this will encourage them to come and set up shop in your nursery or your landscapes. And the upper right-hand corner is a picture of a Chrysoppa larvae taken at the nursery going after those oleander aphids on Asclepias tuberosa. It's exciting when you see it happening in action. Parasitic wasps, now these are curative. You need to have the pest there in order for them to do their job. So we use Aphidius urbi and Aphidius colmani. The female will insert her eggs into the aphid, and the larvae will hatch and eat the aphid from the inside out, mummifying the aphid and then exiting through an exit hole. So ways that you know that it is working, you can take out your hand lens, and if you notice some of your aphids look a little different, have a different color, get a little paler, they've gotten a little larger. Look for those exit holes. You know that they are being parasitized. Really fascinating. If you are interested in how learning more about how these parasitic insects work, I encourage you to look it up. It's really very sci-fi-ish, some of the ways that they parasitize pests. And predatory mites. Predatory mites to eat your problem mites. And again, as I discussed, there are many different species that are being produced depending on your site conditions. We use Amblyosus phallicis in cool, humid conditions. So this time of the year, when we're just in the spring, the cools, they can thrive in those conditions. And then as it gets hotter and drier and humid and a little bit warmer, we use Amblyosus californicus. And some species can live on pollen, so we'll bring those in once we know the plants are flowering, and that's great because then they can build up populations and survive if there's no pest, and just be there for when a pest does arrive. That lower left-hand corner is from Vineland, which they put out a quality control of your beneficials pamphlet, which was really helpful. So how do you know when you're ordering these in that you're getting viable products? And you'll get a container with some bran. And this is a detergent circle that they made to kind of catch the mites as they traveled. What I just do is sprinkle a little on a white piece of paper and watch them scurry around. You know that they're there. We also have parasitic midges. These have become quite useful against the oleander aphid, that orange one that always shows up like clockwork in August. On our Asclepias tuberosa. And they work by laying their eggs in and among the pests. The eggs look similar to the pests, and when the larvae hatch, they have an immediate food source. It really works out for them. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about controls, mechanical controls, biological controls for your pests. And in the nursery, we've gone to extremes. We overwinter a lot of our seed flats, and we find a lot of predation from mice and voles. So we've created these hardware cloths, hardware boxes to store plant materials in. We vacuum up debris around the pots. For mechanical controls, you can prune out infested leaves and stems, physically squishing aphids and bugs if you know that they're the pest problem. Just pulling out and damaged or infested seedlings and trying to save the others, and again setting aside trays and plants while treating them so that they are not moving on to healthier plants next door. Biological control, so ways that you can implement and encourage natural predators. This ranges from investing in a barn cat. Obviously it's a little controversial whether they're going to, hopefully you can find one that prefers mice to birds, but they can do a real good job of just their mere presence can keep some rodents away. You can do perches for birds of prey in your gardens. It's also kind of an interesting sell to residential scapes, to if you have clients who are birders, or public spaces where you can educate the public and get some bird watching in at the same time. Put up some big perches for those birds to come down and hunt on. Again, for the frogs in your garden, to get rid of those slugs, having overturned pots or little clay areas of shelter where they can get in is a great tool. If any of you attended Sam Droge's native bees workshop, he talked a lot a few weeks ago, webinar. He was talking about leaving hollow stems of your plants for bugs, for native bees to be sheltering and overwintering. You can also do that for your beneficial bugs. They like them too. And if it's not aesthetically pleasing to leave the branches, you can bundle them together. You can get as creative as this lower left-hand picture of creating bug hotels. Again, these are commercially available. You can also get plans for them or make them your own way, and they work really well in a public place, really as an educational tool as well. And you get pollinators and beneficials using these. And again, the lacewing box that we discussed earlier, and even barn owl boxes, which I have had on my docket to make for the last year or so. Really simple to make. You can either buy them or get the plans for them. Barn owls are great. An adult barn owl eats 2 to 3 rodents a night, and if it's a family, that increases by 10. So that's more than 2,000 rodents a year. And I mean, who doesn't want to see an owl, right? So now I want to turn to some kind of design and habitat manipulation to conserve and encourage your beneficials in our landscapes. So a lot of these ideas were based on agricultural practices to encourage the agricultural industry to use to integrate different practices instead of using pesticides. But I think there's a real opportunity to create take these same ideas and incorporate them into the designed landscapes as well, especially as we move towards designing for pollinators. Let's include that for our beneficial insects and pest control as well. So habitat manipulation, which is basically what we're doing when we design landscapes, right? We can design and maintain suitable habitat. These include hedgerows, beetle banks. We want long blooming, nectar producing plants throughout the season. As I said, a lot of our beneficials are parasitic and predatory in their larval stage, but are nectivorous in their adult stage. So in order to support them throughout their life cycles, they will need long blooming nectar sources. So leaving areas unmowed, if possible, is a great tool, or doing a late annual fall mowing when they're done with their cycles would certainly help. And of course, using natives is just the first step, as they've evolved with their natural enemies and insects, and therefore naturally encourage their presence. These insects are looking for these plants, so that's just one way. So hedgerows and windbreaks is very traditional English design to separate properties and to prevent against erosion and wind damage. And many studies have found, most of these studies have found that pest populations are lower in native plant hedgerows than weedy field edges. And in addition to that, the ratio of beneficial insects to pests is greater in native plant hedgerows to weedy fields. In that lower right-hand corner, you can see kind of more of a designed flowering border that can be incorporated into a smaller yard. It can be used for privacy hedges, privacy screening, or borders against fences. You can incorporate that into your design and also be helping our beneficials as corridors and wildlife habitats for them to get from one place to the other with a food source along the way. There's also beetle banks and tunnels and piles. Again, that lower left-hand corner is an example of agricultural application, leaving a big strip of native grasses in between cultivated fields to serve as habitat for some of those beneficials. Clearly, they cannot live in those cultivated fields. And I really was trying to find a horticultural design analog for such things, and I found this upper picture on the top of swaths of native grasses. It's just a great idea. You can use little blue stems, Zacharias caparium, if it's on a dry site, or Aerograssus spectabilis, beautiful on medians, and Dyschamsia flexivosa if you have a little bit more shade. And that will really create these habitats for your beetles and your other crawling beneficials. And leaving some of those hollow stems around, again, that lower right-hand corner is producing habitat for them to reside over winter and live. I'm wrapping up here with just a few more ideas. So get your questions ready if you have any. Field border plantings, again, very agricultural setting, helps with erosion control, helps with nutrient runoff on the edges of orchards. This could, for a design or horticultural analog, I would suggest some of the health strips that people have in between the sidewalks and the streets, along the driveway edge, or if you've got a public space with medians, really plant those up for our pollinators and for our beneficials to have a little island on their way from point A to point B. It's a real opportunity there. Cover crops, if you have a project where construction has taken place or complete zeroing out of plant material, if you have a little time before the design goes in, why not put a cover crop down? It will increase soil fertility and encourage those beneficial soil microbes and critters to get established, as well as provide some pollinator a nectar source for your flying insects, until you're ready to go ahead and do that more substantial planting. And on that same note, the temporary insecticides strips are being used in a lot of agricultural practices to encourage pollinators. Putting a strip of long blooming annuals down. They're inexpensive. They can be tilled under with your after your plants, your lettuces and your peppers have been harvested. We can take those same principles and apply them to the designed landscape by adding annuals. You know, a lot of clients I know like a variety of colors and changing throughout the years. So we can encourage that by filling in with the annuals and looking at our native annuals on the left. There is partridge pea, being a great source for nectar for our beneficials. And one thing you want to think about with your annuals is having a very open face. So a lot of asters, alyssum, a lot of small insects and beneficials have very small mouth parts, as opposed to say our butterflies and our hummingbirds. They need to have that pollen very accessible for them to get at. So those are just some ideas to to encourage these beneficials within our designed landscapes. And here are some resources that I have used. University of Vermont, Xerces again is a wonderful resource. They have a lot of pamphlets and plannings and forms and guides. Again, a lot of it is for farming, but you can also maybe take that and morph it into more of your designed landscapes. Some of the suppliers of beneficials, we use BioBest. They have a lot of great fact sheets if you want to check out their website. If you do work with them, they usually have a service technician who can answer all kinds of questions for you. There's also IPM labs out of upstate New York, also can produce. Also has some smaller amounts if you're just using a little bit at a time here and there. And I think that's it. I'll take your questions. And if you need to reach me for anything personally, if you don't get to it, my email is down at the bottom there, adoshas@newenglandwild.org. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alexis. We have several questions. Can you remind our listeners what the name of the institute was that had the list of organics again?
For the organics, the list of organic materials, beneficials, BioBest, or
it was early on.
Oh,
yes.
organic. Oh, yes. OMRI, Organic Materials Review Institute. Yeah, sorry. OMRI, and you can look them up, and they'll have lists of all of the products that are OMRI certified.
All right. Do you know how long neonics stay in the plants? If you buy a new plant and it was treated, how long will the neonics stay in and potentially continue to harm beneficials?
Right. I don't have a solid answer on that. They stay in the plants for a long time. So we, at the nursery, we don't use neonics, and we make sure that all of our partner growers sign a pledge not to use any on our plants. And you should really do that if you're going shopping. You really want to research your nurseries and ask them if they know whether anything has been treated, because studies have found that neonics staying in the plants for a long time and in the soils for up to years in the soil. So it's just something you want to stay away from.
All right, thank you. What was the name of the open source entomology website that you mentioned?
Bugguide.net. It's really great.
Very good. Which of the biocontrol releases are able to establish populations that balance out the pests over time, and which ones are annual treatments that you have to repeat?
Right. So, well, depending on what you are, throughout the season, some of the predatory mites, the Ambliosis, you can build up a population. The OMRI, predatory beetle, you can build up a population, and you can get those fact sheets. It's if they can survive on pollen and other plant material besides just having a pest present. So the Aphidius, the parasitic wasps, need to have a pest, otherwise they will move on. You know, they'll just go on search of trouble. They'll go in search of pests to eat. So that's kind of how you want to do that.
Okay. Have you seen any plants that attract the syrphid flies? This listener thinks that perhaps fleabane would attract them.
I don't know that specifically, but again, I feel like, as I was saying, those wide open daisy-like flowers are really important for our beneficials, because they need to act, they don't have the tools to get down to pollen in more tubular shaped plants. So just think of that kind of design in your plant if you want to encourage your beneficials.
Okay. Can you elaborate on the lifespan of the beneficial insects in the landscape? And do populations establish and become self-sufficient? This is kind of a follow-on, I guess, to what you just answered.
Sure. Yes, I mean, I don't know that I can say I can address the landscape populations besides saying if you supply them with the food sources, then they will be there. And if you're not spraying any pesticides that would be harmful to them, then they will, and you have plant material that they want to forage, then they will be there. They'll be there anyway. The problem is when you are treating areas, they will obviously stay away from them. But their life cycle is just like any insects. They're going to overwinter. They're going to die off in the winters. So it's really more about creating a habitat that they will come and inhabit, and encouraging them that way, rather than, in the nursery, it's more about you having to reapply because you don't have that constant supply of food for them. And a lot of nurseries are investing in banker plants, which is where you bring in annuals or nectar producing plants to feed your beneficials when you don't have when you're not seeing a problem, so that they will be there when there is a problem. So in a landscape, I think you have that much more of an advantage because you can create those pollen producing plants year round.
So if you do have a population that becomes self-sufficient, can you clarify, did you say they will overwinter or they won't overwinter and you have to reintroduce in the spring?
That would depend. I mean, I think a lot of them will overwinter. They'll lay their eggs, and you'll see them again the next year. If you're seeing, a pest problem, you may have to reintroduce. But again, I think if you're just creating the habitat for them, they will show up, as opposed to having to go out and purchase them. Again, if it was a a degraded landscape and you don't think that there are any beneficials around, that may be where you want to augment, purchase some to get them going, and then while your plants are filling in and becoming, more naturalized.
All right. Are there any broad federal or state funding opportunities that you know of for this kind of restoration landscaping?
I would probably contact Xerces. I know that they had programs with farmers, so I'm wondering if it is branching out into more landscape restoration projects. But I know that they were working with farmers and they had grants to help kind of integrate some of these design plans into agricultural businesses. So I'm wondering if they might have another series for more of a design approach or habitat restoration approach.
Good suggestion. Do you have any recommendations for treating high populations of azalea lace bugs?
Oh, yeah. I don't. I'm trying to think what is good for the lace bug. That was something you probably want to look up at, if you could look up BioBest and see what they say. We've only seen a pretty bad infestation in our asters one year, and we tried to physically remove them, and then ended up, just getting rid of some of the plant material to get them out of the way. But yeah, I would probably have to do some research and see which beneficial works best on those.
All right. Can you repeat the solution that you mentioned to clean your tools?
Oh, sure. We use a 10% bleach solution, so just in a spray bottle, a little bit of bleach, and wipe it down.
All right.
We use on plants if there's any. You can use neem oil this is for pests, and what else do we use? We use a Doc Brommer's soap solution. It's a tablespoon and about a 32 fluid ounce spray bottle, and that is for the soft-bodied pests like aphids. It'll dry them right out. But again, you want to do that at a time of day, or if you can quarantine those plants away from where any other pollinators or other insects that you might want not to harm, you can do that.
All right. Do you have a recommendation for a source about the impacts of the neonics?
Let me see. I think again that's probably going to be Xerces Society. They've done a lot of study on that. I pulled a lot of information from them.
All right. You mentioned the cover crops. You had a photo of cover crop. What was the seed mix and what was the source?
Those were, I don't actually know what that was. As far as like particular seed mix, those were certainly some clovers that you were seeing. And I think you can go to Johnny's does a cover mix. Johnny's Selected Seeds up in Maine. I think Fedco has them as well. So it's just a mix of native legumes and brassicas, which are great to restore some soil fertility.
All right. One of our listeners has just provided a follow-up to the question on where can you get information on neonic. The suggestion is Beyond Pesticides as a good resource for that information. Thank you for that.
Okay.
And I think we have just one more question. How do you know if the beneficials are working?
Right. So again, it depends on your beneficial. As I showed you with the parasitic wasp, really monitoring and seeing if you're finding parasitized aphids, if you're seeing a lack of fungus gnats, for instance, you know that's working. Really taking a close look is really it, and also doing that quality control. If you are bringing them in, augmenting buying populations, doing some quality control of the product that you get to know that they are arriving viable before you even apply. because that can be hard. These things are very tiny. They come in tubes with bran, and you're sprinkling them on, and you may not visually see them. So, it's good to do some quality control tests.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up the list of questions that we have. So thank you again, Alexis. I really appreciate all of your time, and good gardening to you all, and may they all be pest-free.